Picture this. You walk through a stone corridor built in the late 12th century. The walls sweat cold moisture. The air is tight, thin, and stripped of warmth. A single iron lantern burns low, its smoke settling on the floor. You hear no music, no voices, only the scrape of sandals on uneven stone. The building is designed for containment, not comfort. Everything is rigid, narrow, confined. This is a convent, and its structure enforces obedience long before any rule is spoken. Outside, the wind strikes the cloister yard without hesitation. Mud piles against the walkways. Rot spreads through the timber beams. A lay sister drags a bucket of wastewater across a courtyard lined with frost. Her hands are cracked from labor. The bell rings once, not for prayer, but for discipline. A novice stands in a corner, head lowered, arms stiff. She moves only when commanded. Nothing here is gentle. Everything here is regulation, punishment, and scarcity. Inside the refectory, the room stinks of damp wool, stale bread, and bodies that cannot wash regularly. A nun coughs into a cloth already stained. Another kneels on bare stone for breaking silence. There is no leniency, no softness, only rules, labor, and the slow erosion of personal autonomy. This is the daily environment. This is the system women entered, whether by force, coercion, or lack of alternatives. If you want more history stripped to the bone, tell me where you're watching from. You move deeper into the institution. The scale of control becomes clearer. Medieval convents operated as rigid enclosures built on layers of religious law, local politics, and patriarchal oversight. Most women who entered did not choose freely. Chroniclers record numerous cases of families depositing daughters to reduce dowry costs, secure alliances with the church, or remove inconvenient relatives from inheritance disputes. For many, this was not a spiritual calling. It was containment. The vows were permanent. The enclosure was legally binding. Canon law tightened around these women like a fixed frame. Once inside, their bodies belonged to the institution. Their labor enriched the convent. Their silence protected the clergy who supervised them. Archaeological evidence shows that early medieval convents were not built for comfort. Sleeping quarters were cramped. Ventilation was limited. Bedding was minimal. Firewood was rationed. Diets were restricted to coarse bread, weak ale, and whatever vegetables survived local climates. Malnutrition was common. Disease spread fast in enclosed, damp spaces. Chronic respiratory infections show up in skeletal remains of monastic women from multiple regions. But deprivation was only one part of the structure. The deeper issue was control. Nuns lived under strict surveillance. Abbesses held authority, but even they answered to male clerics. Priests, bishops, and visiting inspectors entered the enclosure with legal power. Their access was not optional. The women could not refuse. They could not challenge oversight. Records from episcopal visitations reveal consistent patterns: interrogation, discipline, correction, and judgment directed at the women, not the male clergy. This system created vulnerability. Convents were not isolated sanctuaries. They were political institutions embedded in feudal structures. Land disputes, taxation, and clerical corruption could dismantle their operations. When funding declined, the nuns suffered first. Food shortages, unpaid labor obligations, and increased reliance on visiting clergy made them dependent on men who controlled resources and authority. Many convents required dowries. Poor families often sent daughters without adequate payment, creating hierarchies inside the walls. Wealthier nuns gained privileges: cleaner cells, lighter workloads, better clothing. Poorer ones performed heavy labor washing, farming, carrying water, maintaining buildings tasks that physically broke down their bodies over time. The enclosure rule intensified psychological pressure. Leaving was forbidden. Contact with the outside world was limited to small windows, grated openings, or supervised conversations. Letters were censored. Movement was regulated. This was not freedom. It was confinement framed as devotion. Historians agree that sexual vulnerability inside convent systems was a documented problem, not a marginal rumor. Power imbalances made exploitation possible. Clerics held spiritual, legal, and economic authority over enclosed women. In many regions, bishops recorded cases of coercion, boundary violations, and misconduct during their mandatory inspections. The structure allowed it. The enclosure made resistance nearly impossible. Nuns had no legal standing to accuse powerful men. Silence was enforced as discipline, not choice. Yet even without direct abuse, the system itself controlled their bodies. Chastity was not symbolic, it was monitored. Rules targeted behavior, clothing, hair, voice, posture. Regulations dictated how women slept, how they bathed, how they interacted. Any perceived immodesty could result in punishment, often public, often severe. Punishments included fasting, isolation, hard labor, or kneeling for extended periods. Chroniclers described novices collapsing from exhaustion during disciplinary measures, while officials documented the events without concern. Political turmoil further intensified their vulnerability. When armies passed through regions, convents faced direct threats: looting, forced service, seizure of property. Military instability could strip nuns of food supply, heating fuel, and basic security. Records from the 100 Years' War, the Norman invasions, and regional feuds show repeated cases of monasteries being raided, occupied, or destroyed. The women inside had no defense, no mobility, no weapons, and no political leverage. Economics shaped every aspect of their lives. Convents relied on tenant rents, tithes, or the labor of lay workers. When these systems collapsed, the women starved. Monastic chronicles repeatedly mentioned failed harvests, increased taxation, and debt-crushing convent operations. Nuns shouldered the consequences. They ate less, they worked more, they endured winters with minimal heat and no medical care. Daily routines were stripped of comfort. The liturgy of the hours required rising before dawn, standing for long periods, and maintaining precise order. Silence rules restricted speech. Violating them was treated as insubordination. The constant pressure eroded mental stability. Evidence from letters written by abbesses shows concerns about despair, illness, and emotional collapse among their communities. Gender power defined the limits of their existence. The Church granted women spiritual identity, but denied them institutional autonomy. Their vows were binding even if entered against their will. Their property was transferred to the convent. Their bodies were controlled through strict obedience. Their labor enriched male-led institutions. Their voices held minimal authority in public or ecclesiastical court. Most historians agree that the harshest truth is simple. The system did not protect them. It contained them. It taxed them. It controlled them. And it treated their suffering as normal. In this world, survival was not a choice. It was a sentence. You stand in a passage where the air does not move. The walls are damp. The floor is uneven. A novice scrubs the stones with cold water that burns her hands. A senior nun watches her without expression. A priest's footsteps echo from the other side of the enclosure door. No one speaks. Authority enters. Everyone straightens. The silence is not devotion. It is regulation. From this point, the system tightens. Medieval convents were institutions built on layered obedience, shaped by canon law, controlled by bishops, and enforced by local political structures. Once a woman crossed the threshold and professed vows voluntarily or under pressure, she entered a legal framework that restricted her movement, controlled her labor, and erased her autonomy. The Church justified it as spiritual discipline. The reality was administrative containment. Most convents were chronically underfunded. Budgets depended on rents, donations, and dowries. When landlords refused payments or war disrupted trade routes, the nuns absorbed the losses directly. Their food diminished. Their clothing remained unrepaired. Their labor increased. The Church rarely intervened in material hardships. Resources were prioritized for male monasteries, cathedrals, and clerical networks. Female houses received less attention, less funding, and fewer protections. Inside the enclosure, labor was relentless. Chroniclers describe daily routines built on strict sequences. prayer, work, surveillance, correction. Work included agriculture, spinning wool, maintaining gardens, processing grain, caring for livestock, copying manuscripts, laundering linens, and supporting local clerical demands. The labor force was often insufficient. Older nuns worked through illness. Younger novices carried the heaviest loads. Lay sisters performed manual tasks that broke their bodies over time, kneeling, lifting, hauling, and scrubbing for hours. Attire was standardized and harsh. Clothing was coarse wool that trapped moisture and caused skin irritation. Footwear was minimal. In winter, cold penetrated every layer. Convents relied on limited firewood. Many women slept in freezing dormitories, breathing air dense with smoke, damp, and illness. Archaeological findings show high rates of arthritis, respiratory disease, and joint degradation among monastic women. Privacy did not exist. Sleeping quarters were communal. Washing areas lacked barriers. Bodily autonomy was restricted through rules that governed hygiene, contact, and modesty. Abbesses enforced chastity through constant oversight. Violations of conductorial or suspected triggered disciplinary action. Punishments documented in visitation records included forced fasting, isolation, removal of privileges, public confession, and prolonged kneeling on stone floors. Supervision by male clergy intensified vulnerability. Priests, confessors, bishops, and inspectors had legal access to convents. Entry was justified through sacramental authority. Nuns could not refuse. They could not demand witnesses. They could not challenge decisions. Visitations often involved questioning, searching, and evaluating the women's conduct. Chroniclers note frequent abuses of power across Europe. The system's structure created opportunity for coercion, intimidation, and exploitation. Cases of misconduct recorded in ecclesiastical courts show a consistent pattern. Male clergy were disciplined lightly, often transferred. Women involved, willingly or coerced, were punished severely. The Church's priority was institutional reputation, not the protection of enclosed women. This imbalance shaped daily life. A nun's safety depended on the moral restraint of men who operated outside her authority. When restraint failed, the institution shielded the clergy, not the victim. Political conflict added further instability. When armies moved through territories, convents were prime targets. They held food stores, livestock, and grain. They had limited defense and no armed protection. During the 14th and 15th centuries, numerous convents in France, Germany, and Italy were looted or occupied during regional conflicts. Nuns faced starvation, forced service, or displacement. Ecclesiastical authorities documented these events, but rarely intervened effectively to provide security. Economically, nuns occupied the lowest tier of the religious hierarchy. They engaged in production textiles, manuscripts, agricultural goods. Profits flowed upward. Convents owed fees to bishops, taxes to landlords, and dues to the church. Failure to pay resulted in sanctions. Debt was common. Some convents resorted to mortgaging land or accepting poorly trained novices for financial survival. These economic pressures shaped everything from diet to discipline. Education varied widely. Some elite convents provided structured learning, but most offered minimal instruction. Literacy rates fluctuated, influenced by resources and clerical priorities. Many nuns spent their lives performing repetitive labor with no intellectual opportunities. The church emphasized obedience over scholarship. Women with strong academic ability were exceptions, not the norm. Medical care inside convents was limited. Remedies relied on herbal knowledge, prayer, and basic treatments. Infectious diseases spread quickly in enclosed spaces. Ventilation was poor, sanitation was minimal, and medical theory was underdeveloped. Mortality rates were high during epidemics. Records from the Black Death show entire convents wiped out in weeks. Survivors were tasked with burying the dead, maintaining operations, and securing new novices to preserve land rights. Internal hierarchy created additional pressure. Abbesses held authority but were still constrained by male oversight. Conflicts over discipline, resources, and interpretation of rules often escalated into formal investigations. Power struggles were common. Senior nuns enforced conformity. Younger nuns endured rigid obedience training. Disputes over food, punishments, or property were treated as moral failings rather than structural problems. The vow of silence intensified psychological strain. Extended periods without speech limited social bonding and increased isolation. Breaking silence resulted in punishment. Speaking out of turn during work or prayer was treated as insubordination. This rule eroded communication and created an environment where grievances remained unspoken. Forced enclosure was the most defining element of monastic life. After profession, leaving the convent without permission was illegal under church law. Women were effectively removed from society. Their futures, relationships, and autonomy were erased. The enclosure was not symbolic. It was physical, legal, and permanent. Some families used convents to dispose of daughters viewed as burdens, disabled, illegitimate, politically inconvenient, or unwanted. These women entered the system with limited support and limited prospects. Their lack of dowry placed them at the bottom of internal hierarchies. They performed labor that wealthier nuns avoided. Their value to the institution was economic, not spiritual. Throughout Europe, evidence shows widespread dissatisfaction among nuns. Letters, visitation records, and complaints documented by abbesses describe exhaustion, hunger, illness, and fear. Many women entered unwillingly and lived without hope of release. Dispensation from vows was rare and required connections most nuns did not have. The institution functioned efficiently not because it provided stability but because it enforced compliance. Fear sustained order. Scarcity sustained discipline. Patriarchal oversight sustained the structure. Women endured because the alternative, public disobedience, legal punishment, or family repudiation, offered no escape. Convents were not sanctuaries from the brutality of medieval life. They were extensions of it. Power belonged to whoever could enforce it. You step into a workroom where the air is thick with the stench of wet wool. A lay sister beats cloth against a wooden block until her hands shake. Another sharpens iron tools used for cutting leather. A novice coughs repeatedly, ignored by everyone. The door opens. A cleric enters without knocking. No one resists. Authority passes through the room as if it owns the air itself. From this point, the system reveals its internal mechanics. Convents were governed by a combination of monastic rules, diocesan oversight, and secular power structures that intersected without coordination. The women inside faced multiple layers of regulation that often contradicted each other. Obedience was demanded even when rules were unclear. Abbesses enforced discipline, but lacked the legal power to challenge bishops. Priests supervised spiritual life, but reported only to male authorities. Nuns occupied the lowest rung within an already confined institution. The vulnerability rooted in these structures was not abstract. Historical records show repeated instances where clerical oversight produced direct harm. Bishops conducted visitations designed to inspect moral discipline, financial management, and enclosure adherence. These inspections often involved interrogating nuns individually. The imbalance of power was absolute. The women had no right to representation, no access to external courts, and no means of appealing decisions. Every verdict came from the male hierarchy. Visitation documents from England, France, and the German principalities show a consistent pattern. Accusations against nuns were pursued aggressively, while accusations against clergy were minimized or ignored. When misconduct occurred, remedies focused on protecting institutional reputation, not individual women. Forced penance, confinement, or public humiliation frequently targeted the victims of power abuses rather than the perpetrators. The Church's administrative priorities were clear: maintain order, preserve authority, prevent scandal. Economic pressure made the situation worse. Convents were expected to support themselves through agriculture, rents, and craft production. When these systems failed, the nuns bore the consequences physically. Many houses owned insufficient land. Others paid crippling taxes to local lords. Drought, war, or plague shattered economies already stretched thin. When resources dwindled, food rations dropped. Meat was rare. Fresh produce vanished during winter months. Water supplies were often contaminated. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, intensifying disease outbreaks. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals clear signs of repetitive manual labor, spinal compression, worn joint surfaces, untreated fractures, and chronic infections. These marks reflect the physical demands placed on women who worked long hours under strict supervision. Lay sisters performed the hardest tasks, tending fields, hauling water, repairing buildings, grinding grain. Choir nuns faced lighter physical labor but heavier disciplinary oversight, with strict schedules governing prayer, reading, and service. The architecture of convents reinforced the lack of autonomy. Enclosures were designed to restrict movement with high walls, locked doors, and narrow entries. Windows were small and barred. Rooms were arranged to maximize surveillance. Dormitories had limited space and minimal privacy. The refectory enforced silence through layout and rule. The chapter house served as a disciplinary court where women confessed faults, received punishments, and endured correction. These buildings functioned as instruments of control, not comfort. Disease control was primitive. Convents lacked advanced sanitation. Waste disposal depended on simple pits or basic drainage systems. Water contamination led to gastrointestinal illnesses that spread rapidly. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were common. Outbreaks of influenza, sickness, skin infections, and respiratory illnesses were routine. Medical treatment relied on herbal remedies, purgatives, and prayer. Chronic pain and disability were normalized because resources for care were limited. Psychological strain was equally documented. Letters from abbesses expressed concerns over despair, disobedience born from exhaustion, and mental collapse. Extended silence rules prevented women from forming supportive bonds. Punishments for emotional expression were severe. Novices endured rigorous training that emphasized self-denial, obedience, and suppression of individuality. The system rewarded compliance and punished deviation. This atmosphere eroded mental stability over time. Sexual vulnerability remained a structural issue, not an isolated incident. Convents were dependent on male clergy for sacraments, confession, mass, last rites, spiritual guidance. This necessity undermined autonomy. A priest's access to nuns' private spaces was justified through religious obligation. Inspectors reported on the women's behavior but rarely documented their own. Power imbalances were embedded in every interaction. When coercive incidents occurred recorded in episcopal registers, they were treated as moral failures of the women rather than abuses by men in authority. Transfers, penance, and silence were common responses. Legal constraints further restricted the women's options. Canon law allowed the church to control their property, bodies, and labor. Attempts to leave were treated as violations requiring punishment. Some women attempted escape. Others refused vows after entry. Most were forced back through family pressure, clerical intervention, or legal mandate. Dispensations from vows were rare and granted only with elite connections. For the majority, profession was a lifelong sentence. Political instability compounded these pressures. When territorial conflict erupted, convents were exposed. During the 14th and 15th centuries, chroniclers recorded raids in which soldiers seized grain, livestock, and valuables from convents. Nuns had no means of defense. Some houses were abandoned. Others were forced to relocate temporarily. The church documented losses but did not provide adequate protection. Security depended on local alliances, not institutional support. Internal conflict also shaped daily experience. Disputes over hierarchy, discipline, or resource distribution often escalated into formal complaints. Abbesses used punishments to maintain order, restricted meals, mandatory silence, forced labor, or confinement. Visitations reveal frequent accusations of lax discipline, including allowing novices too much rest, providing extra food to favored nuns, or failing to enforce enclosure rigorously. These conflicts reflected structural flaws, not personal failings. Gender dynamics built the final layer of constraint. The church praised female piety, but restricted female agency. Women's spiritual authority was limited. They could not administer sacraments. They could not critique clergy. They could not travel without permission. Their writings required clerical approval. Their voices carried little weight in ecclesiastical courts. The convent placed women in a paradox, responsible for spiritual discipline, yet denied institutional power. Despite these pressures, the church presented monastic life as the ideal form of female devotion. This narrative concealed the reality of forced vows, economic exploitation, surveillance, and isolation. The daily hardships endured by nuns, hunger, labor, political vulnerability, and institutional control exposed the gap between doctrine and lived experience. Most historians agree on the central truth. The medieval convent was not a haven from the brutality of the era. It was an extension of its systems, regulated, constrained, and shaped by the same forces that oppressed the wider population. Most people lived and died unnoticed. You pass through a narrow cloister where the stones are worn from years of identical footsteps. A bell rings. Every head turns. Movement stops. A novice drops a bucket and freezes as it spills across her feet. The abbess appears instantly. No shouting, no expression, only command. Work resumes. Order is restored. There is no space for error. From this point forward, the structural pressures intensify. Medieval convents functioned inside a rigid framework built on surveillance, labor, extraction, and religious control. Every action repeated the same principle: obedience before comfort, duty before self, and silence before truth. These were not abstract values. They were mechanisms that maintained the institution at the cost of the women inside. Food scarcity shaped daily life. Most convents relied on inconsistent agriculture and small livestock. Chroniclers describe gardens destroyed by storms, wheat fields damaged by frost, and granaries emptied by soldiers during conflicts. When food stores failed, nuns rationed their meals to bare minimums. Thin broth, stale bread, diluted ale. Malnutrition was common. During winter, hunger increased as supplies dwindled. There were no allowances for weakness. Work continued regardless of physical state. Sanitation remained minimal. Waste pits overflow. Water sources were often contaminated by runoff from nearby villages, livestock areas, or battlefield remains. Outbreaks of dysentery, fevers, and skin infections spread quickly. Illness did not excuse labor unless a nun was incapacitated. Even then, care was basic and inconsistent. The infirmarian relied on limited tools, herbal poultices, vinegar washes, fasting, and prayer. Mortality rates rose during epidemics because surveillance rules restricted movement and reduced air circulation. Internal hierarchies added another level of strain. Choir nuns and lay sisters lived under the same roof but experienced entirely different burdens. Lay sisters worked long hours in fields, kitchens, and workshops. They slept in inferior quarters. They received fewer rations. Their daily contact with clergy was minimal, limiting their ability to report abuse or seek protection. Choir nuns had a more regulated schedule but faced constant scrutiny from leadership. Every deviation was recorded and punished. Discipline was standardized. Punishments documented and visitations included reduced meals, forced silence, kneeling on stone floors, isolation in small cells, and public confession in the chapter house. These punishments targeted behavior considered disruptive, speaking without permission, questioning orders, or expressing frustration. Emotional outbursts were treated as moral failures. Mental suffering was interpreted as spiritual weakness, not a result of the harsh environment. The vow of permanence intensified pressure. A professed nun surrendered legal authority over her body, labor, and future. Leaving the convent without permission was considered a violation of canon law and could result in excommunication. Families who placed daughters in convents rarely offered support afterward. Economic burdens and social expectations made retrieval unlikely. For many women, the walls were not symbolic, they were the boundary of their existence. Convents also functioned as financial institutions. They received dowries, managed lands, and collected rents. These assets were controlled by abbesses, but remained subject to oversight by bishops and local lords. Financial conflict was common. Secular authorities attempted to seize convent lands. Church officials demanded payments. Some convents fell into debt and were forced to mortgage property or accept untrained novices to secure income. Economic survival often outweighed spiritual mission. Corruption shaped many of these interactions. Bishops used visitations to extract fines. Priests demanded payment for sacraments. Local elites leveraged influence to place relatives in positions of authority. Nuns had little defense against these pressures. The system offered no clear appeals process. Complaints were rerouted back to the same authorities who created the problems. Structural inequality ensured the women remained dependent on institutions that did not prioritize their welfare. Education remained inconsistent. While elite convents produced scholars, most houses lacked trained teachers. Novices learned basic Latin phrases, devotional reading, and practical tasks. Intellectual development was secondary to obedience and prayer. This imbalance reinforced the hierarchy. Women who could read or write held more authority, while illiterate nuns performed manual labor. Knowledge became another form of internal control. Political instability continued to affect monastic life. During the 100 Years' War, many convents in northern France and the Low Countries were plundered or forced to provide resources to passing armies. During the Italian conflicts of the 14th century, convents were frequently caught between rival factions. The church offered minimal military assistance. Nuns concealed valuables, hid livestock, or evacuated temporarily when possible. Most could not leave. They waited behind walls while armed groups took what they wanted. Forced confessions were a documented problem. Priests conducting spiritual oversight questioned nuns about purity, conduct, and obedience. These interrogations were invasive and often coercive. Cases recorded in ecclesiastical court documents show that confessions made under pressure were used to justify punishments, reforms, or leadership changes. Nuns attempting to defend themselves faced disbelief. The church prioritized reputation and structural control over individual truth. Gender restrictions determined every aspect of authority. Women lacked the right to administer sacraments, oversee priests, or participate in ecclesiastical councils. Their spiritual output flowed upward. Their material conditions depended on male judgment. Abbesses had internal authority, but remained subordinate to bishops. Spiritual decisions required external approval. The hierarchy ensured women remained dependent, monitored, and replaceable. Daily schedules were rigid. Bells divided time into segments that controlled movement, silence, prayer, work, and sleep. Chroniclers describe days that began before sunrise and ended long after dusk. Deviating from the schedule was treated as disobedience. Chronic exhaustion was common. Sleep deprivation weakened health and intensified vulnerability to disease and psychological strain. Enclosure laws created long-term consequences. Women entered convents at ages ranging from childhood to late adulthood. Many who joined young never experienced autonomy before vows. Their adult lives were shaped entirely by institutional demands. Those who entered as adults often did so after bereavement, economic loss, or social pressure. In both cases, the convent replaced family, community, and independence with a disciplined system built for efficiency, not humanity. The Church's official doctrine portrayed the convent as a place of purity and devotion. Historical evidence shows a more functional reality. These institutions operated as controlled environments that produced labor, preserved property, and maintained social order. Women inside them lived under constant oversight, restricted freedom, and limited support. In every recorded era, the pattern remains consistent. Structural authority outweighed individual welfare. The system did not adapt to the needs of the women it contained. It required compliance, sacrifice, and endurance from those with the least power. Law existed to protect the few, not the many. You wake before dawn because a scream jolts you upright, a short choked sound cut off halfway. At first, you think you imagined it, but then you hear footsteps rushing down the corridor, You don't move. You don't ask. In a medieval convent, you learn quickly. Silence keeps you alive. The stone around you is freezing, the damp clinging to your skin as if the walls themselves have teeth. You sit in darkness and wait for the bell, knowing that whatever happened will be classified as sin, madness, or divine punishment, never as a crime, never as harm. The convent protects itself long before it protects anyone inside it. When the bell finally rings for matins, you step into the hallway. 2 nuns scrub the flagstones with sand and cold water. You see a dark stain under the bucket, thick reddish, smeared into the pores of the stone. No one speaks of it. No one looks at it. You walk past it because the system trains you to act blind, deaf, obedient. The corridors smell of lye, smoke, and something metallic that refuses to wash away. Cold air whistles through the cloister, and your hands tremble as you fold them into your sleeves. Fear is a constant here. It never leaves. It only changes its shape. By breakfast, a new rumor spreads through the refectory. Sister Beatrice has been taken to the penitential cell. No reason given, none needed. In many convents, this was the fate of any woman who resisted authority, disobeyed a confessor, cried too long at night, questioned a superior, or simply became inconvenient. You eat your coarse bread and weak ale in silence, listening to the scraping of wooden spoons and the muted shivering of the women around you. Every one of them knows what the penitential cell looks like. A stone chamber with no heat, a narrow bench, a window too high to reach. Some women were kept there for hours, others for days, some for weeks. You have no idea which fate awaits Beatrice. Later, you reordered to help in the herbarium, a task that sounds gentle but is anything but. The herb mistress hands you bundles of wormwood, valerian, tansy. Some calm the mind, others purge the body violently. These plants are used not only to heal but to punish. A woman deemed rebellious might be given purgatives harsh enough to keep her doubled over for hours. Another might be dosed with sedatives until her speech slurred and her will dissolved. The line between medicine and discipline disappears inside these walls. As you crush the herbs with a mortar, the herb mistress speaks without looking at you. Obedience keeps a convent from rotting, she says. Resistance invites rot. You can't tell whether it's a warning or a justification. You keep grinding, your hands aching, the dust bitter in your throat. This is how the system sustains itself, through fear disguised as divine order. By midday, you're sent to assist the sutler. The undercroft beneath the convent is colder than winter air, the stone sweating moisture. Barrels line the walls, some filled with preserved food, others with wine kept for visiting clergy. You notice how much of that wine has been siphoned off, how often priests arrive with an appetite not only for drink but for power. You carry crates, stack jars, sweep the floors, all while hearing muted voices from the far end of the cellar. A priest is speaking sharply. A girl responds in a whisper. You don't go nearer. You don't need to see. Every convent had corners where power operated unchallenged. When you return to the main building, the abbess calls you aside. Her eyes are sharp, unreadable. She tells you that the convent will be inspected soon, meaning a bishop or a noble patron will arrive to judge the discipline of the house. Inspections were moments of pure terror, because one wrong impression could result in mass punishment. The abbess warns you to keep your head down, to answer only when spoken to demonstrate piety with every movement. You nod because refusal is impossible. The system does not reward honesty, it rewards invisibility. Throughout the afternoon, you scrub floors until your knees bruise, polish brass candlesticks until your fingers blister, and air out the dormitory even though the cold bites through the thin shutters. Everything must look immaculate so that whoever walks through those gates sees order, not the suppressed suffering underneath it. The other women move in silence beside you, exhausted, expressionless, resigned. You recognize something in their faces, not holiness, not devotion, but the numbness of people who have survived too much for too long. Just before Vespers, a lay servant slips you a piece of information. Sister Beatrice's cell has been sealed from the outside. That means she isn't simply being disciplined. She's being erased. In some convents, women who caused embarrassment were hidden until they wasted away. Others were declared possessed or mad. Others were written out of records entirely. You feel sickness rise in your stomach, but you say nothing. To speak her name is to invite her fate. After prayers, you walk through the cloister alone. The evening air is sharp, and the setting sun throws blood-red light against the stone columns. You hear footsteps echo behind you, slow, deliberate. You turn and see the confessor approaching, his face half in shadow. He asks why you're alone. You answer carefully, respectfully, calculating each word. His expression never changes. He tells you that solitude breeds sin, that a woman must never trust her own thoughts. He dismisses you with a gesture sharp enough to be a threat. You return to the dormitory with your pulse pounding. You lie in your straw mattress, staring at the rafters. The smell of mildew fills your lungs. All around you, women breathe shallowly in the dark. You can feel their fear. It sits on your chest like weight, like stone, like inevitability. Night deepens. Somewhere far down the corridor, a door scrapes open. Someone is being moved. Someone is being silenced. And you realize the truth you've been avoiding since you arrived. The greatest danger inside a medieval convent isn't poverty or disease or isolation. It's the system itself, a machine built to keep women contained, obedient and unseen, no matter the cost. Part 6 will go even darker. The collapse of the system, when the outside world begins tearing into convents, exploiting their secrets, exposing scandals and turning your quiet prison into a battlefield where you have no protection at all. You wake to a sound you've ever heard inside these walls before. Voices from outside the gate, angry, loud, insistent. For years, the convent has been a sealed world, cut off from the townspeople except for the occasional delivery or inspection. But something today is different. You feel it in the frantic steps of the lay sisters, in the tightness of the abbess's jaw, in the way no one meets your eyes at breakfast. Fear moves through the convent like smoke. Whispers ripple across the refectory. A scandal involving another nearby convent has surfaced. A priest accused of exploiting novices. A noble family enraged at the disappearance of their daughter. Rumors of a secret burial. In the medieval world, news spreads fast when it can be used for power, punishment, or political advantage. And today, that news is heading straight toward you. Before you can finish your bread, the abbess orders all nuns into the chapter house. You sit on the cold stone floor as she tries to maintain control. Her voice trembles as she warns you. Inspectors, clergy, and secular officials may arrive. You must show piety, unity, silence. But the fear in her face betrays something deeper. She knows the system is breaking. For centuries, convents could hide their abuses behind walls, vows, and divine authority. But when noble families get angry, when priests get caught, when political interests shift, those same walls become targets. The gate slams open. You hear boots on gravel, cloaks snapping in cold air, male voices demanding entry, demanding answers, demanding access. You feel your stomach tighten as the officials push inside. Their presence is not gentle, not pastoral. It is invasive, hungry, searching. They sweep through the cloister with authority that even the abbess cannot challenge. You stand with the others in the nave as the men walk past you, examining everything: the quality of your clothing, the state of the dormitory, the bruises on the hands of the novices who scrubbed floors all night. Their eyes are cold, calculating. You're not a soul to them. You're a witness, a liability, or a scapegoat. Nothing more. The bishop's representative begins questioning the abbess. His voice echoes harshly against the stones. Why was Sister Beatrice confined? Why was she sealed away? Why were the accounts altered? Why is the wine cellar missing 3 barrels? Why did a priest from this convent travel to another house last month under a false reason? Why are so many novices sick? Why were the infirmary records burned? The abbess tries to answer. Her voice breaks. The men do not soften. They descend into the undercroft, into the scriptorium, into the herbarium. Every hidden room, every locked door, Every place where secrecy once offered protection is now a trap. Their torches illuminate cracks the convent has spent decades plastering over, and with each discovery, you can feel the tension in the air tightening, pulling, stretching toward breaking point. Then comes the moment that shatters everything. A lay servant, shaking and terrified, confesses that Sister Beatrice is not resting in penitence, as the abbess claimed. She is dead. She died in the cell 3 nights ago. No burial, no last rites. The body still inside. The officials freeze. The abbess collapses to her knees. The room seems to tilt as you try to breathe. There were always rumors of women disappearing, of names erased, of confessions forced, of punishments that lasted too long. But now one of those tragedies has a body, a real, undeniable, incriminating body, and the system that hid everything is cracking under the weight of its own cruelty. The men storm toward the penitential wing. You follow at a distance with the others, your heartbeat pounding in your ears. When they break open the sealed door, the stench rolls out first. Stale air, damp stone, human decay. You see the officials recoil. You see the abbess bow her head as if she already knows what they will find. The moment they step inside, the truth becomes impossible to contain. The convent erupts into chaos. Some women break down sobbing. Others pray frantically, begging forgiveness for sins they never committed. A few look numb, as if this final blow simply confirms what they've known all along. That the institution built to guard them would one day destroy them. The officials order everyone out of the wing. They seal the area with wax and rope. They summon more guards. They announce without emotion that the convent is under investigation and may be dissolved. Dissolved. The word hits you like a physical strike. A dissolved convent means displacement, interrogation, punishment, scandal, exile, terrifying uncertainty. For the rest of the day, the officials interrogate the sisters one by one. You sit in a cold chamber, answering questions that seem designed to trap you. Did anyone mistreat Sister Beatrice? Did the abbess know? Did the confessor force discipline too harshly? Did you ever witness anything? Did you ever suspect anything? Did you ever speak about it? Did you ever remain silent? Your mouth is dry as stone as you answer. The truth is that silence was survival, but now silence is guilt. By nightfall, the convent no longer feels like a religious sanctuary. It feels like a crime scene. Guards patrol the corridors. Doors are barred. The officials search through every chest, every parchment, every locked cupboard. Secrets that were once buried under layers of ritual and obedience are being dragged into daylight. You return to your mattress and sit in the dark, listening to the storm outside. Rain lashes the shutters. Wind rattles the dormitory roof. The other women cannot sleep. Their breath trembles in the freezing air. Everything you once understood about your life, the routines, the punishments, the hierarchies, the terrors, is dissolving with the institution that enforced them. You realize something brutal and simple. You were never safe because the walls were never meant to protect you. They were meant to keep you. Now those same walls are falling, and what waits outside is not freedom, but a world ready to judge you for sins committed by those who held power over you. A world where a nun without a convent is a burden, a scandal, a target. A world where your vows matter less than the politics swirling around your collapse. As dawn approaches, you sit upright, sleepless, staring into the grey light creeping across the stones. The system is dying, and you must now survive what comes after it.